Jerusalem awoke like on so many other holy days. The incense was prepared, the altar purified, and the ancient words waited to be pronounced. Everything seemed correct. Everything seemed intact. But that morning, something invisible had been removed. There was no thunder nor sign in the skies, just an absence difficult to name. The sacrifice rose, the rite advanced, and yet no answer came from above. For there are moments when judgment does not descend in fire, but in silence. And when heaven falls silent, it is not the end of the ritual that begins, it is the end of the illusion. What you're about to hear is written in the scriptures, echoed through history and remembered by faith. This is SacrumLore. The temple breathed routine. Each stone knew the weight of priestly steps. Each corridor kept echoes of psalms repeated for generations. There nothing was improvised. Everything followed an order so ancient that many no longer remembered why certain gestures existed. They just repeated them, certain that heaven would continue answering as it always had answered. But that day did not carry the same density as the others. The air seemed too light, as if it had lost something invisible. There was no perceptible glory, nor deep fear, nor that quiet sensation of being observed from above. Just movement, just function. The priests started early. The ablutions were done with care. The sacred vestments adjusted with precision. The lamb was separated, examined, considered adequate. Everything was correct according to the law. Nothing could be accused of negligence. Still, something was missing. The younger ones did not notice. For them, the service was learning, technique, honor. But the older ones, those whose hair had already turned white in the service of the altar, exchanged discreet glances. They said nothing. There were things one did not dare say inside the temple. The smoke of the sacrifice rose thick, as it always had risen, but it seemed to rise alone. There was not that ancient sensation of response, as if heaven welcomed it. It was like speaking and hearing no return whatsoever, not even a distant echo. For centuries, Israel had believed that the temple was the fixed point of the world. If heaven and earth touched somewhere, it was there. But the prophets had warned, often ignored, that God did not dwell in buildings when the heart of the people turned to stone. Still, Jerusalem trusted in the solidity of the walls. While the rites continued, the city around followed its common rhythm. Merchants shouted prices, children ran through the streets. Roman soldiers observed everything with trained indifference. Life went on without knowing that on that exact day, something had changed forever. Heaven was not distant, it was attentive, but it had decided not to answer. This silence was not sudden. It had been prepared for generations. Every rejected prophet, every ignored warning, every injustice covered up with sacrifices had pushed the people to that exact point. The silence was not impulsive punishment, it was a mature consequence. The ancient writings spoke of a time when God would hide his face, not out of cruelty, but to reveal what really sustained the faith of the people. Jerusalem believed that it was enough to continue the ritual. Heaven demanded more. On that day, the temple still functioned, but it was no longer the center of divine communication. What was once a door was becoming a memorial. What was once a path was becoming a shadow. Few noticed, but outside the temple walls something was growing silently. A movement without an altar, without incense, without visible hierarchy. A man walked between villages and cities speaking of repentance, of a kingdom that did not depend on sacred stones. Some said he spoke with authority, others said he forgave as if he were God himself. The temple ignored these rumors. After all, heaven had always spoken there, but on that specific day, heaven chose not to speak. Inside the holy place, every gesture was fulfilled as if there was still a guarantee, but access was being re-evaluated. The system that required constant repetition of blood was reaching the limit. Not due to a flaw in the law, but due to a flaw in man. The silence became heavy as the day advanced. There was no visible error, but neither was there confirmation. It was like walking in the dark without stumbling, yet still knowing that something was wrong. God had not abandoned his people. He had decided to approach in another way. What was about to happen would no longer fit inside the temple. The answer would not come from the altar, but from a cross. It would not come from the incense, but from the final sacrifice. That day passed without incidents. No stone fell, no fire descended from the sky, no cry of judgment echoed through the streets. And precisely because of that, it was one of the most decisive days in history. Heaven fell silent because it was preparing the definitive word. And Jerusalem, surrounded by rites and certainties, did not notice that the silence was the last sign before the eternal change. They say that when heaven falls silent, it is because it is choosing the right words. Jerusalem moved forward, thinking that nothing had changed. But the silence stayed, traversed the days, and still today weighs upon those who confuse habit with faith. To hear this story is to accept that God does not always shout. Sometimes he waits. If you want to continue hearing reports like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This keeps these stories alive.